I know you might not believe it, that they actually do a lot of work here. There's all these offices in the back, but we have taken over. Oops. So on behalf of the Milken Institute, I want to welcome everyone tonight. For anyone who I haven't met, my name is Mindy Silverstein, and I'm the managing director of the Institute. I want to welcome all of you and our speakers, certainly our honored guest, His Excellency President Kagame from Rwanda, Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Masiyiwa, the chairman and founder of Econet Wireless, our gracious host here, the founder and CEO of Liquidnet, and the chairman of the Access to Global Capital Initiative, Seth Merrin, and Mike Milken, the chairman of the Milken Institute. So we're thrilled to have you all here today. Before we start our program, we wanted to take a brief moment to think of the victims of the tragedy at the Westgate Mall in Kigali. Several members of our Investing in Africa working, in Nairobi. That was a really bad slip. That was when I decided not to look at my notes, and now maybe that's a note for going forward. So I apologize. So some of the members of our Investing in Africa working group are not with us today because they've lost friends or loved ones, and I know there may be people included in that here. We're very fortunate to have one of the truly inspirational leaders on the planet here with us today with President Kagame, and so I've asked him just to say a few brief words before we begin.
Well, thank you. What you've just mentioned relating to the attack, the terrorist attack in Kenya, in Nairobi, wasn't just an attack on Kenya or Nairobi. It reached many other places, given that many people, even from different parts of the world, got caught up in that situation. There was, for example, an incident where somebody working with the CGI, the Clinton Global Initiative, was killed there, a young lady who was very active in Kenya, and many others, quite many, from the different parts of the region, of the continent, the rest of the world. So really it was an attack on everyone. And we just needed, and some of us have already done so, to associate ourselves with the Kenyan people and government and what they were going through, to just let them know that they shouldn't feel alone, that we are all with them, and I'm sure they have the capacity to go through that and manage what has happened and get that behind them, but we also are with them in that, and I'm sure I will be saying that on behalf of everyone here on this panel and in the audience. I'm sure everybody has been thinking about that, and our hearts and prayers are with them, and also we are ready to work with them in any way for them to overcome that and leave it behind them. So that's what I can say.
Thank you very much. We're here to build on a conversation that started more than 20 years ago when Mike Milken founded the Milken Institute, and actually far longer ago than that with some of the things that Mike did. When he started the Institute to advance economic and policy solutions to create jobs and widen access to capital. And then about a year ago, Seth Merrin had an idea about how we could truly try to tactically implement our mission, and so was born the Access to Global Capital Initiative. As many of you know, our work with the initiative seeks to accelerate the flow of capital into emerging and developing countries by linking multinational firms and global investors with governments that are committed to policies that enable economic growth. These policies will increase transparency, foster skills transfer in domestic industry, and create a more seamless flow of capital and commerce. The initiative is a global effort, and we're working with 3 pilot countries, Indonesia, and I'll be heading there next week as we try to further our efforts there, Colombia, and Rwanda, which we're focusing on today. As you can see, we have some great momentum. To give you an idea of the types of things that we're doing with our work with Rwanda, right now we have a global opportunity index that we launched as part of the initiative. And right now, Rwanda actually doesn't have all the data included to be in the index. And so we're working with the team there on the ground to be helping them to collect all the data. So they won't only be in our index, but they'll be in a lot of other indices that investors look at around the world. We also, my colleague Stacey Warden, who's the head of our Center for Financial Markets, is sitting there right there with Ambassador Gatate. And so the finance minister in Rwanda and many others on that team looking at domestic capital market development and also thinking about regional capital market integration. And then we're also doing, as we like to do at the Milken Institute, facilitating a lot of connections. And these connections right now, we're working with the Rwandan Development Board under Claire's leadership. And we know of over 25 that are still remaining active. Many of you are involved with some of those organizations. And some of them have actually already led to significant commitments. One of them that you'll hear about today, that will result in growth of jobs and strategic industries. So we're very excited, and that's part of what we're doing here today, is celebrating that. In terms of the format for this session, I'm going to go through and ask each of the panelists a question so you can get their perspective. And then we plan to have some time for Q&A at the end. So with that, I'm going to move to you, my friend. So Mike has famously said that on his at his first speech on Wall Street in 1969, that the best investor is a social scientist. And with that in mind, there's been a lot of headlines in the last month or so about some flows going out of emerging markets, not all of them, but some. So Mike, why don't you give us really the macro picture to think about why investors must continue to look towards emerging and developing markets?
Thank you, Mindy. And Seth, I just want to commend you for your efforts in this initiative, and the world will be far better for what you've started here. I just want to commend you for that, Seth. And I think it was 1965, Mindy, when we had something called the Watts riots in Los Angeles. Came down. And I was home from Berkeley during the summer, and I could not understand why Los Angeles was on fire. It was the middle of the Vietnam conflict, but you didn't have to go to Vietnam to see this. You could see it right here in Los Angeles, a city of dreams, a city where if you lived there for 2 years, you were considered a permanent resident from that standpoint. And it was difficult for me to really understand until I had met a young African-American man, who watched the burning down of a factory he worked in. He was married, had a child, now he had no job. It seemed to me very irrational. And it started a long relationship which we've had with Nobel Prize winner Gary Becker, who wrote a paper on why irrational actions could be rational at the time. And it taught me that one of the rights was access to capital. And I went back to Berkeley and gave up trying to be an astronaut and run our space program and decided to work on finance. And I wrote down this formula, which in many ways is true today as it was then, and that really is prosperity. What do we want for our society? Job creation, opportunity, hope, but prosperity, that access to capital, financial capital, served as a multiplier on the largest asset category, human capital, the second largest social capital, and real assets, something that most people in the financial world focused on, which could be accounts receivable, cash, plant, equipment, and other things. But the real asset for a city, for a region, for a country was the productivity of the people. And there's 3 ways to increase that human capital. 1, you increase the length and the quality of life, healthcare. 2, you increase their knowledge and education. Or 3, immigration. You recruit talented people to come to where you live. And when you step back and look today at much of the emerging markets, this year, for the first time in 200 years, what we think of as emerging markets, those economies are now larger than the United States, Europe, and Japan. So at one time, the United States, and Canada, and Europe, and Japan made up 80% of the world's economy for less than 20% of the world's population. But this crossover that's recently occurred, to me, is the underlying reason why we need to focus on what some people refer to as the emerging markets. This is the growth area of the world. They someday will have 70% or more of the world's economy. So no matter what you're interested in, whether you're in the financial world, whether you're in the industrial world, this is the key. And there's a number of requirements. In the terms of social capital, one of them is good government. And we're lucky to have probably the leader in that area in the world today, Tony Blair, with his initiatives and this governance initiatives to try to get good government in countries to allow people to flourish, get people to invest, etc. The next one is really this human capital, life expectancy. And when we look back at an area that had the greatest growth in the world, East Asia, and you see that life expectancy over a 60-plus year period of time grew 70%. Much of the biotech and pharmaceutical developments and sanitation developments in the United States, Europe particularly, and somewhat Japan, led to this, with a dramatic increase from low to mid-40s to 70 in just the lifespan that we live in. If we look at these increases over the last 50 years, you see much of the greatest increases in life expectancy and quality of life have occurred in Africa. So once you've been able to extend life, improve the quality of life, just imagine where 90% of the women passed AIDS on to their children, to an environment today with proper medical treatment. 98% of the women with AIDS do not pass AIDS on to their children. It is a tremendous change, and that's one of the reasons why the fastest growing part. The other area is access to technology. And if you stood and said, what was the environment just 12 years ago? If mobile phones is the leader in terms of access to technology and the technology that is provided, well, 2% penetration in Africa in 2000. And it's projected that we'll have 84% penetration. And I'm sure if Strive has his way, we'll probably have 100% penetration by 2015. But dramatic growth and change. And lastly, just the recognition is once you bring education, and what's interesting in Africa, more than any other part of the world, the largest percentage of government budgets are for education. So the ingredients, education, increased quality of life, good government, access to knowledge and technology will only lead to enormous growth. And if you want to be an investor or focused on the future, Mindy, you have to be focused on what's called emerging markets. It's just hard to think of Korea, China today as emerging markets. They've obviously emerged.
Thank you, Mike. Seth, so with that setup, why don't you talk to us a little bit about the objectives of the Access to Global Capital Initiative and how it looks to capitalize and accelerate some of this investment?
Sure. The example that Mike uses quite frequently is the comparison of Jamaica and Singapore 50 years ago having the same GDP. And in 50 years, and you can say the same thing about South Korea and Ghana, also similar. You can see the difference in the trajectories in those different countries. And they had to go it alone. There was no template, there was no manual that they could follow. But they did it, and they did a remarkable job. And now they created that template. And there is a so-called manual in how to accelerate the growth in GDP, the growth in job creation, the growth in per capita income. And you think about the disparities and what we have at our disposal today that we could actually help to accelerate the growth in those areas. Well, we could do this. And we started out, and our experience in Rwanda started with a project that my wife started at the Agahozo Shalom Youth Village that Liquidnet backed and has sent a lot of volunteers to. And it was through that experience that we got to understand President Kagame and what he's done with the country. and the implementation of good governance. And you go to Rwanda, and it's all open hands. It's, you could start a business in 24 hours. There's no corruption. There's no litter on the streets. Everybody goes to school, and it's absolutely remarkable. And the concept really is about incentivizing really the good governments and rewarding the good governance by partnering with the Milken Institute to actually introduce corporations to invest in those countries. And a lot of companies, every country out there is trying to get foreign direct investment, and it's a very, very competitive field. And for those folks out there that did not know about Rwanda, for us to be able to introduce Rwanda and have such an incredible response, enthusiasm, and people actually going and visiting Rwanda to actually make the investment. I just want to point out Rajiv Nair from UST Global, who's an example of this, who's thinking about a great technology company, global technology company, and it's in line, completely in line with the president's vision of creating a technology base in Rwanda, in Africa, for Africa. Rajiv and his company went to Rwanda, made a visit, incredibly impressed, and we're now talking about partnership and going in and actually starting a business in Rwanda in a very, very short period of time. That's the example of the success. And of course, it's first of all, the village creates the human capital that's necessary. There are 500 kids at this village. We graduate 125 every year. President Kagame was at the first graduation, and these kids that were on the street 4 years ago listening to the president say, "You are the future of our country," that is amazing. And those are the kids that we can actually introduce to start. That's the spark that starts the growth in GDP and job creation and per capita income. So the concept is really to help these countries accelerate that growth. Because in the West, in the United States and in Western Europe, we have 700 consumers, right? There are 1 billion people in Africa. Imagine, just selfishly, being able to create another 1 billion consumers. Africa is ripe for doing just that. Now, it takes time, but with our help and with the partnership, and especially with the partnership that we're announcing today with Tony Blair's organization in terms of implementing good governance in these countries, well, that is absolute. That is the start. That is what every investor needs, and we've spoken to investors all over the world, and it's about knowing that the rules of the country are not going to change from one year to the next, knowing that you can invest in the country without having to pay a lot of people with hands wide open, knowing that there is rule of law. Well, President Kagame has done this, and what I think is what he's demonstrating is what is the reward for that good governance, and our partnership is really about accelerating that and doing it throughout the rest of the world as well. So Rwanda, it's our home away from home, quite frankly, but hopefully it's just the start.
Thanks, Seth. So that's actually a great segue to Mr. Blair. As Seth mentioned, we know that market size is important, and that's something that we do hear a lot about from investors. But probably more than that, more than anything, we hear about the need for good governance. And so why don't you tell us a little bit about what you see the appetite of government leaders to focus on governance in Africa and in other emerging markets? I know you're in other countries. And then what is the most important thing that the governments can be doing to attract capital?
Thanks, Mindy, and thank you, Seth, for having us here at Liquidnet. And it's always a great honor to be with President Kagame. And Strive, thank you so much for coming and doing this today, because you can tell us from the point of view of the person who's actually doing it in business terms on the ground. And thank you, as ever, to Mike Milken for the work that he does, not just in this area, but right around the world. Whenever I listen to you speak, though, I have a you give me an acute sense of my own inadequacy. So I was a bit worried about that. But anyway, I feel I'm learning, though, every time I hear you. Look, my governance initiative, which actually the map's a little out of date now, by the end of this year, we'll probably be in 10 different African countries. And it arose out of two things that I did when I was Prime Minister. The first was a focus on Africa and an acute appreciation of the fact that the relationship that Africa wanted with the West was shifting from what you might call a rather old-fashioned donor-recipient relationship. You know, we felt sorry for people, so we gave some money, right? That type of relationship, to a relationship where that donor-recipient notion was replaced by the idea of partnership and by the idea that, in fact, the development of Africa was both good for Africa but good for the world outside too, but that it had to be done in a way that was quite different from before. So when we put Africa on the G8 summit for the first time in 2005, we did so not just to cancel debt and increase levels of aid, but in fact to introduce a whole new concept of partnership and change in which good governance would become every bit as important, if not more important, than aid in changing the way that Africa and African people lived. So that was one change, if you like, development in political thinking that the Africa Governance Initiative represented. But the other was actually born out of my experience in the UK as a Prime Minister for 10 years, when I realized that you know, it was only about 2 years into being Prime Minister when I had the epiphany of understanding that the fact that I sat in Downing Street and had an idea and told someone to go out and do it, you know, the epiphany was realizing that didn't mean that anything happened. In fact, it probably meant that nothing happened. And I realized and then started to focus on what is the real challenge of government today, which is far less to do with 20th century ideology and is far more to do with efficacy. How do you get the thing done? How do you get the job done? So these two things came together in a realization, one, that the future of Africa lay in the quality of governance, and two, that if you were going to improve governance, you had to focus on practical implementation. And you know, I visited many African countries where you would get these great sort of poverty reduction strategy reports written by the consultants who would come in and go out again, all of which were absolutely magnificent, but none of them said how you prioritize what is really possible and how you get what is possible translated into reality. So that's what the African Governance Initiative is about, and what we do now is we have teams of people, as in Rwanda, where we will have a team of people that will live and work in the country alongside a team of Rwandans, in this case, and the nationals of the country. And the purpose of it is to build the capacity to get things done, to work out what are the key priorities, ruthlessly then to focus on performance managing and pushing them through. Because one of the other things that's curious about the world of politics is that, as I always say to people, you campaign for office as the great persuader, and then you get there and realize you've got to be a great chief executive. And those two skill sets, by the way, can be completely different. So the issue for us then is, how do we take those challenges of governance and help get them done? And that leads me to this point, which is that, in fact, for many, many African countries today, what needs to happen is not really very hard to see. Doing it is hard, but analyzing what they should do is not that hard. And again, there are some developments in recent years that I think are very, very important. First and foremost, they need the infrastructure. Mike's slideshow there, I mean, even telecommunications infrastructure, it's fantastically important. It's got a liberating effect, but you need access to it. Electricity and power is the single most important thing that countries need in Africa today, because if they get the electricity and the power, then their everything else is then possible. If you don't have it, then very little is possible. Roads and infrastructure, ports, airports, and everything is important. But infrastructure, particularly around the power sector and telecoms, absolutely vital for the future. Now, that's something you would have had a slightly different conversation about 20 years ago. Secondly, rule of law today is really important. It's one of the things that distinguishes countries that are going to develop to the next level and those that don't. Again, it's not hard to see what it means, but it has to be done. And it squeezes out the corruption and other things that don't just inhibit the integrity of a nation, but actually inhibit its decision-making, because you're making decisions on the wrong basis. So that, again, is immensely important. And then the quality of inward investment is fundamental to the development of the country. And this is something else that I learned both in government and from looking at the world, that the thing that is really important is to apply the same lesson that you would apply in your ordinary life to the issue to do with how you develop your country. So with me, there's lots of things I don't know how to do. So rather than trying to find out how to do them by a process of trial and error over a very long period of time, if I'm able to bring someone in who can help me and bring in that intellectual know-how, then that's a sensible thing to do. That's what you do in your life. It's what you have to do in your country. So the quality of inward investment is really, really important to the development of the country. If you take a country like Singapore, Singapore 30 or 40 years ago was importing intellectual capital. Today it's exporting it. But they wouldn't be exporting it if they hadn't first imported it. And sometimes when countries say to me, we've got to do it our own way, we don't want outside people coming and telling us what to do, my response is always, why not? I mean, if I don't know the answer, I'd like someone to come and tell me. And actually the countries that have got the confidence and are going to go places, like Rwanda, are those that say, yeah, come and help, teach us what you know. And one of the fascinating things about the work we did in Rwanda is we began actually in the president's office helping build capacity there. But here's the interesting thing. The team of people that I had there, after a year, a couple of years, the local Rwandan team were absolutely superb because they figured out how to do it themselves. And I always remember the presentation they gave me and you after we'd been there a couple of years, and this was a presentation done by the local Rwandan people. I would have been happy to have that team in Downing Street any day of the week. So, this is what it's all about. And the reason why the inward investment then is important is not just that it brings in the finance and can create jobs, but what it does is it brings in that management and intellectual know-how. And that then has a huge effect on the development of the country. So, our initiative has been designed to help the development of the country. And, I often say this to the leaders I work with in Africa, that our ambition is to get to the point where we hold the party at which we then say farewell to the donor community. Thank you very much. But now, you're probably going to say, thank God those lot are gone finally. Because I know that the only trouble with the donor community is if you're a finance minister, as John would have better say, you spend as much time negotiating with the donor community as you do doing anything else in your lives. But the purpose of the whole thing is to get to the point where countries take their destiny in their own hands, where they can develop in their own way. And to do that, this idea of quality investment coming in is absolutely essential. The final point is just to say the opportunity is obviously immense. I'm in Africa many, many times in a year. You can just feel the energy. Now, in Rwanda, it's been very clear over the last few years. But in the projects we do in other countries, like, for example, Sierra Leone, where I was a short time ago, you just, for the first time in the last year, I've actually felt it. You can just feel it's moving. And that is an immensely exciting thing. Thinking of Tanzania, Ghana, other whole series of countries now in Africa, and the energy and vitality is there. There's a whole new generation of civic, business, political leaders who are just of a different quality from what's gone before. And when I came here this week and sat down with Jim Kim at the World Bank and a group of new African leaders, the quality of that conversation, the determination of the leadership, the focus of it, I can't imagine having had that conversation 10 years ago. So this is a very exciting moment, in fact, to get involved in Africa, and it's an inspirational place to go to and to work in.
Thank you.
Mindy, just two comments. One, we always have to remember that it's easier to build than to rebuild. Where there's infrastructure, where there's people that have made major investments in existing technology, they resist change. You can see that in mobile telecommunications versus wireline. And so the potential to build is so significant. And the other thing that Mr. Blair touched on, which is very interesting, you know, people from developed countries often think their management skills are better than those in emerging or developing markets. What we have found over a long period of time is those that are successful in emerging markets, in young economies, are actually more talented. It was a lot easier in different environments. Having interest rates at 5 to 10% a month and surviving gives you strength. Okay, if you can survive in that environment, you might be able to survive in any environment. And so we sometimes look at things through the wrong lens. A person who was born into a poor family with challenges and determination and had a great deal of initiative to succeed often had much better preparation than a person who was born into a family of wealth and never had that opportunity or those difficulties in life, and will have a very hard time later in life when they haven't had to face those difficulties.
Thanks, Mike. So it's been referenced several times in this conversation about Rwanda's success. It's certainly well known in this room. 8% annual growth over the last 5 years. Child mortality is down by 70%. We could go on and on with that. You know, speaking of this momentum that Mr. Blair spoke about, President Kagame, why don't you tell us what you see as the things that you need to do in Rwanda, and then what are the things that you need externally to take it to the next level of growth?
Thank you. Before I come to that, let me give it a little bit of background where we have really come from. And a number of things have already been said by Honorable Blair, contextualize everything quite well. But let me say where we have come from in Rwanda. If you look at where we were 20 years ago, immediately after the tragic situation of genocide and then building after that, we had the whole world trying to help after the genocide, bringing humanitarian assistance and so on and so forth. This was costing money, definitely. And in actual fact, had we Rwandans sat back and felt comfortable with receiving that kind of help, we probably would be in that kind of situation even today. So what we did was to say, right, we needed help, we were helped, but in a few years after 94, we started interacting with those who were helping, the donors. And we were telling them that maybe we need to organize ourselves and do things differently. As we help to deal with the emergency situation, we need to be thinking about another step, and that is building something so that we don't stay in this emergency situation. In fact, I should say straight away from here that the relationship with the Honorable Blair we had was around that time in mid-90s, 97, 8, and so on, when he came to power. Because his government, traditionally, which was not, at the time, which was not a traditional donor to Rwanda, actually was leading, UK was leading the donor community in terms of giving support to Rwanda. And they opened up the way because when we insisted on saying, look, let's work together, let country systems work, let's create them, let's develop them, and allow the government in place, even then, even if it was a transitional government at that time, we insisted, we said, we must lead the way. But we can work together and benefit from these resources differently. Many donors in the donor community resisted that because that was not the way they were used to doing business. And it's like, we will bring this and we will tell you how to use it, and that's how we move. But we insisted. We were also very firm and said, no, we need to work together as real partners. In fact, we even said, and we called upon the many NGOs that were in the country then, very helpful, but also disorganized. And so much was flowing through the country, but very little impact. And we said, no, the best way is let's coordinate our activities on the ground and allow the building of the foundations on which a country can build for its future, not just helping forever and that not making any impact on the ground. So that's really how we took off, and UK led the way in the donor community and influenced that, agreed to doing things differently, and that's how our country started taking off and moving forward. Now, right from the beginning, we understood that to do things differently and for different things to happen other than what we have been used to, and that is poverty and all kinds of stuff in Rwanda, or because really the situation in Rwanda, even if it was to the extreme side, mirrored what happens elsewhere in Africa. And as we were dealing with our own situation, so we were saying, and we believed in good governance, and we said we have to carry out reforms in governance, political and economic. We have to invest in our people, in education, in health, and so on and so forth. We have to start investing in infrastructure because this will again, so of course the issue was where does money come from? And therefore money was coming. In any case, we were receiving money, but that was not very helpful. So we said we could use this money that was coming in such a disorganized way to actually start flowing to doing the very things we need to do for a better future. And this is where the struggle was. And that's how we continued to move on. And this is what has given us to be where we are today. Now, you can have the reforms going on. You may be lucky and the money flows to build infrastructure and so on and so forth. But there are key things that have been important and in which, again, I come to conclusion of when I raised the key issues here. But there is need for capacity to be built, human and institutional capacity. And again, this is where we concentrated, and again, as I was saying, Tony was the Prime Minister then, and we were doing fine, so I would have wished he stayed in office for much longer. But I'm trying to say, even after he left office, we've been working, so I don't regret that he left office because we are still doing quite fine, and has been very helpful. Because when we met immediately after leaving office, he had already been thinking of what he wanted to do after office. And I had already been thinking about what to do while I'm in office. And that was about building capacity, that's building institutions, and that's how AGI came to be associated with Rwanda and has been doing tremendous work in Rwanda that we are still building on. And it has allowed us to bring in other partners. Even today, as we may talk about Milken Institute, which is now partnering with us in developing the domestic capital market, and many other partners. Seth mentioned something, Strive is engaged, and so on and so forth. But capacity is what we concentrated on. We built institutions, gave them capacity. We built, we invested in people. And as Tony again said, we brought in people to work with our own and help develop them. And this is really what has allowed us to continue taking off. And once this is, the setting is ripe as it is, it has allowed people to invest in the country, as well as we have been working very hard on regional integration, because Rwanda is a small country trying to develop itself. It just makes more sense if Rwanda is seen and is playing within a wider market of the region, and that's why we treat regional integration as very important. And that's even the investors who have come to invest in our country, we give them the thinking that they should not just be thinking about investing in Rwanda, but it should also be seen as through Rwanda to the wider market of the region, and whether it is the commodities exchange that is developing, and whether it is Visa International that is working there, and many other players. So this is the main focus, and this is what we need to keep doing, more of the same.
Okay, great. So that's actually a great segue to Strive. I know that you may have to leave soon after you answer your question to catch a plane. But this is a great segue, because I heard you in a meeting a day or two.
Unless you want to fly with me at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Yeah, he's flying to London, so it works out. So in a meeting yesterday or the day before, you said that governments must create the conditions for capital to come in. And so typically when we have our roundtables, they're actually around a roundtable. So I didn't mean to have it be such a misnomer tonight. And next week in London, we'll continue this conversation with investors, giving very direct feedback to government representatives, with Mr. Blair with us as well. But why don't you tell us now, because you're our representative on this panel, of the private sector. You're in 14 different African countries, working in many places in the world. I know that at one point you had looked at Rwanda and turned away, and then in the last few months, we're really happy to see that you went there. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Thank you, Mindy. And once again, thank you, President Kagame, for those words you spoke, which comforts us all at this difficult time. We're all very moved by the situation that has occurred in Kenya. Much of what I need, positive feedback, we say. I don't want to revisit much of the wonderful things that have been said. I'm an African. What happened to the engineer? Can you hear me without it?
Why don't you try? And
I'll
try.
Yeah. I'm an African businessman. Often when we talk of investors in Africa, it seems to be synonymous with people coming from outside Africa. But of course, we as African business people are also investing in Africa. I have been investing in Africa now for 30 years. And we have operations and activities in 17 African countries. And we just added Rwanda in the last few months. We build telecommunications infrastructure across Africa. And quite often we have to use capital from investors even in the United States. We promote investments and we go into different African countries. And of course, capital is very timid, at least modern capital. They read the newspapers long before we've read them. They've been on the when I wake up in the morning, my American investors have already sent me emails about what they've heard happened in Africa. So we are dealing with a situation where everybody is fully informed about what is going on around the world. And of course, talking of our own business, our principal objective is to invest in Africa. And we spend a tremendous amount of time looking at every single African country. We know what's going on. We have friends, many of whom went to school with. And we're always trying to see, how do we deploy capital in this country? When we made our decision to go into Rwanda, it ticked off all the boxes. I love Rwanda. I go there regularly in my philanthropic activities. But we didn't enter Rwanda for philanthropy. We entered Rwanda because it made good sense for our investors. We made the decision to go to Rwanda as we would make the decision to set up in Germany. It ticks all our boxes. And let me just talk a little bit about them, if I may. Political stability is key, because our capital, you can't pick it up and run with it on your back if things have gone wrong. Can we go in? Can we be assured of consistency in the policies that are being pursued? Can we deploy capital and people? And who's going to run our business there? Because you see, once you can go in and sign an agreement to build something, but we need people, and the majority of the people we need in any business are going to be nationals. Rwanda has an incredible skills pool, or potential that you can turn into highly skilled people. So it ticked off a very important box for us. As someone mentioned earlier on, the rule of law, which can be extremely expensive, I can tell you. If there isn't rule of law, everything is out of the way. So, of course, it's a small market, but it's an incredible gateway to the market in that part of the world. We are in every single country in East Africa. So we know its geographic location and the potential it offers us to expand into that region. And I'll stop there because I'm sure we will have an opportunity to pick up other issues later. Thank you.
I just want to comment for a moment on what Strive has said. He spoke about rule of law. That's social capital, an important element in any society. Good governance, social capital. He spoke about talent of individuals, human capital, and that education. So in building a country, these are the cornerstones. It was also discussed infrastructure, etc. I would just stress, let's not look back, let's look forward. At this time, according to Stephen Chu, Nobel Prize winner, former Secretary of Education in the United States, the world is only using 8% of the energy of the sun. We don't know how long the sun's expected to be good for as a source of energy. A minimum of 4 billion years. Some people think longer, probably longer than our lifespans. And so the sun, it's quite possible Africa and parts of Southern Asia will be the first ones to really effectively deploy the sun as an energy source. Charging your mobile devices, etc. When you don't have a power plant, you don't have a dam, you don't have hydroelectric power, you have a power that's going to be with us a lot longer than any of those, and that is the sun. And so as we look forward, it is estimated by the Institute that the United States will be short by almost 70 million people that are qualified for technology-oriented, other skilled jobs over the next decade. So yes, you could have full employment, but you don't have the workforce. And I think the enormous investment that President Kagame made in the education of his people If you travel to China 20 years ago, the real change was, yes, building infrastructure and roads and ports, but the emphasis on elementary schools, early child care education. There were more professors and teaching assistants in 1993 in the United States than college students in China. Today, there's a multiple of the United States and college students in China. So things can change very quickly. It doesn't take generations. We sometimes forget that it was less than 30 years ago in America that a woman was given an opportunity to lead and control a company that was one of the largest companies that she did not inherit. The first time in America was less than 30 years ago, when there was a great deal of backlash. For an African-American man, it was only around 25 years ago that they had access to capital. So many of these things, we're not talking about hundreds, 50 years ago. They're in recent history. And so I think it's very important when we look at opportunity that we're looking forward, not looking backwards.
Thank you. So I have more questions, but I do want to open it to the audience if we have any questions or...
Mindy, can I ask Strive a question here?
Of course you can.
Strive, there's a lot of challenges in life, and we talk about good government. And we talk about Rwanda as an example of that, and some of the other countries you're in. You have survived successfully in Zimbabwe. What are the lessons that you've taken away from Zimbabwe that we could learn from?
As you said, Michael, our business in Zimbabwe is the largest company in the country. We're the largest single taxpayer and the largest employer. So when inflation started to go through the roof and hit 500 billion%, it was not...
I don't have it with me, it's in my briefcase, but I
see.
do have my $100 trillion bill.
So was such a thing?
Worth a few cents.
I think the most important lesson for us, it was like, you could look at it like a storm, Hurricane Sandy just over the city of New York for a couple of months, because that's what we were dealing with. The key is the quality of people you have running the business. And it goes with any crisis. We've had crises in other countries where we've operated. You've got to have good people who know what they're doing and can keep a cool head, because otherwise you lose everything. So that was the most important lesson for me. It was really about people, the quality of the people that you have to deal with, that you have deployed in that country. Because in a situation like that, you have nothing to give them, except that you have to be able to talk to them and persuade them that we're going to get through this.
So have any of you thought of any good questions, or we can keep going? So President Kagame, so much fun. So in a session, a meeting we had the other day, Mo Ibrahim talked about the importance of larger markets, and you referred to this a little bit about regional integration. And you talked about a few examples of things that were already starting to take hold, and then kind of the next wave that would need to happen. Would you like to speak to that a little bit?
Yes, we've been strongly encouraging integration to take place, and we are seeing, say, 5 countries in the region: Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, coming together, and in fact there is likelihood more may come in, including South Sudan, and we are even looking at the possibility of bringing together, there's an organization called IGAD, and then East Africa, it might extend to 11 countries, and then, so it makes a lot of sense. And as we've been integrating and working hard We have created a customs union in East Africa. We are working out different things to create a common market. We have been talking about, people are even looking at the future kind of political federation that would really, strengthen this. But we go step by step. In fact, we have even allowed, while within the region, the integration may take very long, 5 countries or more, you find 1 or 2 or 3 are responding faster than the others. And we have even allowed now that those who can move on with certain aspects of this integration will move on. We don't have to be 5 all the time. We can even move 3, we can move 4, while the other one may be dealing with some of the problems they think they have. It's like we did the other day, just because we are looking at, say, areas of infrastructure in East Africa, these 5 countries I was talking about, when we found there were some delays and some aspects of integration because of some countries were thinking differently or moving at a different pace, we moved on with the 3. And we are looking at railway, energy projects, and oil pipeline. And we said we can move the 3 who have the urgency to move, but we would still leave space for the others to come in as and when they feel they fit in. But we still kept the integrity of integration going. So therefore that connects the wider market. It's no longer just Rwanda, 11 million people. It's now 135 million people of the region. And really what is on the mind is to give comfort to the investors, people bringing in capital, that the capital will flow across this wider space and not confined to one single country. And it makes sense for everyone, for us, for the investor, and it works faster to bring about the kind of transformation we are really thinking about. And here I want to clarify one single point which works generally for the whole of Africa, because Africa has been looked at as a continent, poor continent, and it's not just about Africa trying to escape the poverty trap. It's about Africa wanting prosperity. So it's no longer just dealing with the poverty issues. It's prosperity now. It's wealth creation. It's the big things that we need to be looking at.
Mindy, we also, talk about the challenges, how to get 3 countries to work together, 5 countries to work together. We sometimes forget, for example, in the United States, when you wanted to move electrical power from West Virginia to Virginia and get permission to do that, it took 13 years. So I think we see these challenges in emerging markets. I think if we step back and you ask yourself, what do we know for sure is going to happen? We don't know when it's going to happen, but what do we know is going to happen? As an investor, you have to invest in where things are going. We know someday that the world's largest middle class will be in India. Now, for many people, it's hard to find a country that's more frustrating than India, okay? It's a messy democracy, okay? But ultimately, if you're selling product and you want to do business, and they need trillions of dollars of infrastructure, this will be the world's largest middle class. And 29% of everyone in the middle class today expects their child to get a PhD. Quite a challenge, since only 7% of the people in the United States have a graduate degree. But the respect for education, the fact that they'll be the world's largest population, and ultimately will be the world's largest consuming country from that standpoint. The question is, what is the time? What's the effort? Is it a straight line? Is it not a straight line? We know that Africa is young. The continent is young. And so when you look at the age We know everyone who's going to be 40 in 20 years is born today, unless we have some new technologies to speed it up. And so you can look at the future today. Japan today is close to the oldest country in the world with the average age around 40. And see, we're going to put that up. But we just sometimes forget how young parts of Africa are. And when Mr. Blair says you can feel the enthusiasm, if we think of the American dream as a chance to succeed based on your ability, that quote, American dream, is alive and well, I think, in Africa and these places you travel today. Just to see, to go from 2% to 84% mobile penetration in 15 years, how many generations have you skipped in that period of time? And we all fully understand that you get better reception if maybe you're calling from someplace in East Africa than you do if you're calling from Brooklyn. So we shouldn't necessarily think of these things as barriers. We should think of them as opportunities and speed. Mindy, I have some property in Malibu, California. I don't know whether my grandchildren or my great-grandchildren are going to be able to enjoy it when we get permission to build. It's somewhere between 40 to 60 years from now. So I really see the movement as quick in Africa. You might feel it's slow, but relative to parts of the industrial world today, it's quick. And with the young, increasingly educated, there are tragedies such as we saw in Kenya. And we wish everyone would respect human life on this planet. But unfortunately, the West doesn't have that great a record either. They were killing each other for 1,000 years in Europe. And we wish we could learn from the mistakes that others have made in previous centuries. And we hope that human beings don't have to repeat those things. But one of the things that Seth said that is so insightful is Singapore really didn't have a template. In many ways, South Korea didn't have a template. Taiwan didn't have a template today. But there are examples of countries without natural resources that built great economies and very productive societies and fulfilling societies by educating their people. Africa has both. A very unusual opportunity here. Natural resources that are extensive, a young population, and led by Rwanda and other countries, an enormous respect for education. And so, we are so excited about what you do. Could you talk to us about the power source for a moment for all these mobile phones where there is no power station to plug into?
Yeah, I was going to ask if anyone on the panel wanted to speak about the potential with Power Africa, because it's obviously a huge opportunity coming to the South.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'll be brief. You know, in our business, as you pointed out, we've reached penetrations now in our mobile business of 70, 80%. We're in Botswana, where actually our penetration there is 150%. So they have almost 3 phones in their pockets. But what we found was we were losing revenue because our customers could no longer charge their phones. People were traveling miles just to get a phone charged. So we developed a phone charger using solar power. And we made that also a light. We began to sell these units, and we realized that there was a greater business there. We now sell more of them than we sell cell phones. So we manufacture them in China, and we distribute them now to some 40 African countries. So solar energy, even though we talk about the huge power deficit, and I noticed one of my colleagues is building a big power plant in Tanzania, which is a very important project. But our people are not on the grid. So we have to turn to renewables. And whilst I'm talking about light, just a simple light, just in education, by providing a light to a child in a village, you can add 20-30% to their performance because they can now do homework. So these things are interconnected, but I was I very much agree with your thinking about renewable energy and what we should, that it is the energy for Africa for me.
I think what's interesting is that what I know is happening now in Africa is a lot of innovative projects like Strive has just been talking about are also being matched by a recognition that some of these big infrastructure projects that people have talked about for a long time, I think are now possible in a way they weren't before. I mean, I think of the East African Railway, which I think the President was referring to, which is a project that's been talked about for a lot. The World Bank is now getting involved in really trying to bring it about. I suspect it will come about now. Some of the, for example, now the major hydro project in the west of Africa, in the Congo, Kinshasa, I think is now actually the first phase of it. They've now finally agreed to do. Inga. They've now agreed to do. And the Power Africa, which was launched by President Obama, which we also connected with a few months ago, is going to lead to a significant increase. Paul's there is one of the people building the power stations and distribution networks in the whole of Africa. The president of Mozambique that I was with this morning explained to me that in the course of literally the last 10 years, the number of people with access to electricity in the country had increased from 8% to 37%. Now, he was still very anxious and frustrated that they hadn't gone further than that, but the fact is that is a massive increase. So my point is what I think is happening, which is why I think, I think now is the opportunity in Africa, is that you can just, you can see some of these things that people have been talking about for a long time are now going to really start coming together. And I often say to people, I think Africa is maybe where Latin America was 20 years ago. But actually, when I think about it, I'm kind of more optimistic about Africa in the future, because I think it has managed over time to escape what are some of the ideological problems that there are in Latin America. And I think the quality of African leadership coming through now is very, very strong, and they're focused on the right type of partnerships in order to get these things to happen. So, I think this is a very opportune time, really, to have this initiative.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a great way for us to wrap up. Certainly, we do feel it's an opportune time and a great opportunity to work with Mr. Blair and the African Governance Initiative. I see Nick Thompson right here in the front, who we're working with, for the Milken Institute to partner with you as you bring governance and we bring capital to the table to incentivize those positive changes. So from here, we continue to hopefully grow the initiative. I see Ambassador Jalal has snuck in the back from Indonesia, and I'm looking forward to seeing his guest in Indonesia in a week or two as we look to expand to another region. We will reconvene in London, as I said, next week at the Milken Institute Summit to continue this dialogue. And we definitely are looking for more partners, people who are interested in investing and looking at these opportunities, and hope to actually bring a group of investors to East Africa, to Rwanda, in the next 6 months. Before we close, because I know a lot of people have planes to catch or meetings to make, I do want to thank Seth for his leadership in helping us, obviously, as Mike said at the beginning. Mike, obviously, for his leadership, as I get the fortune to work with him. And many of you who are working with us, the team at Liquidnet, our partners of working with Nick and the folks at AGI, the country representatives like Ambassador Jalal and President Kagame, Claire, and Ambassador Gatate and others, and our team at the Institute. I'm the one who's standing up here, but Stacy and John, who are here from our Center for Financial Markets, David Rice, who is our Africa advisor, who traveled with me there this summer, and Clint, who many of you have spoken to, who lives and breathes this every day. Thank you for all of your efforts. And I think with that, we're a wrap. Thank you all for being here.